The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Kensington Palace as Sergeant William Hayes adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time that day. At 52 years old, he had served the royal family for nearly 3 decades, and his dedication was written in every crease of his weathered face and every perfectly polished button on his uniform. The other guards often joked that William could stand at attention in his sleep, but today something felt different. There was an unusual tension in the air that made his shoulders tense despite years of training to remain composed. Prince Louis, now 8 years old, had always been different from his siblings. While Prince George carried himself with the natural authority expected of a future king, and Princess Charlotte displayed the confident charm that reminded everyone of her late grandmother Diana, Louis possessed something else entirely. The youngest Wales child had an uncanny ability to notice things others missed, to ask questions that made adults shift uncomfortably, and to appear in places where he perhaps shouldn't be. The palace staff had learned to expect the unexpected when it came to the spirited young prince. William remembered the first time he had been assigned to Louis's detail. The prince was barely 5 then, but even at that tender age, he had looked up at the towering guard with those piercing blue eyes and asked, "Why do you look so sad when you think no one is watching?" The question had caught William completely off guard. How could a child so young read emotions that even his own wife struggled to detect? That moment had marked the beginning of an unusual bond between the seasoned guard and the perceptive prince. Over the years, William had watched Louis grow from a curious toddler into an even more curious child. The prince had a habit of wandering through the palace corridors, his small feet making barely a whisper against the ancient stone floors. He would pop up in the most unexpected places, behind tapestries, in forgotten alcoves, sometimes even in rooms that were supposed to be locked. The cleaning staff had grown accustomed to finding small footprints in dust where no child should have been able to reach. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, often worried about her youngest son's adventurous nature. During family meetings with the security team, she would express her concerns about Louis's tendency to explore. "He's not being defiant," she would explain, her voice tinged with both pride and anxiety. "He's just incredibly curious about everything around him. Yesterday, I found him in the library, reading a book about the palace's history that was written in 1847. He said he wanted to understand why some rooms felt happy and others felt sad." Prince William, despite his busy schedule and royal duties, always made time to address these concerns seriously. He understood better than most the weight of growing up under constant scrutiny, and he wanted his children to have as normal a childhood as possible while still preparing them for their future roles. But Louis presented a unique challenge. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that some family secrets must remain buried? How do you tell a child with an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations that sometimes ignorance truly is bliss? The palace itself seemed to respond to Louis in ways that puzzled even the longest-serving staff members. Mrs. Margaret Thornton, the head housekeeper who had worked at various royal residences for over 40 years, often spoke in hushed tones about the strange occurrences that followed in the young prince's wake. Doors that had been locked for years would somehow be found open after Louis had been in the vicinity. Old photographs would be discovered, moved from their usual positions. Most unsettling of all, staff members reported hearing what sounded like whispered conversations coming from empty rooms, only to find Louis sitting alone, apparently listening to something only he could hear. Dr. Elizabeth Harrington, the family's trusted physician and confidant, had spent considerable time observing Louis during routine checkups and family gatherings. She noted in her private journals that the child displayed an emotional intelligence far beyond his years. "He seems to absorb the feelings of everyone around him," she wrote. "It's as if he's a living barometer for the emotional climate of any room he enters." While this gift could serve him well in his future royal duties, I worry about the burden it places on such young shoulders. The other children in the family had learned to accept their brother's unusual insights as simply part of who Louis was. Princess Charlotte, despite being only 2 years older, had taken on a protective role. She would often be seen guiding Louis away from situations that might overwhelm his sensitive nature, or creating distractions when his questions became too probing for comfort. Prince George, with the weight of future kingship already beginning to shape his young character, sometimes seemed almost envious of his brother's ability to see beyond the carefully constructed facades that surrounded royal life. On this particular morning, as William took his position outside the family's private apartments, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to unfold. The prince had been unusually quiet during breakfast, barely touching his favorite jam tart and responding to his parents' questions with distracted nods. When Catherine had asked if he was feeling well, Louis had simply looked up with those penetrating eyes and said, "I dreamed about this sad lady again. She wants me to find something." The mention of this sad lady had become a recurring theme in Louis's conversations over the past few months. He would speak of her with a matter-of-fact tone that children use when discussing imaginary friends, but there was something in his descriptions that made the adults around him uncomfortable. According to Louis, the sad lady wore old-fashioned clothes and appeared in various parts of the palace, always looking for something she had lost. She never spoke to him directly, he explained, but he could feel her sadness like a weight in his chest. William had been present during one of these conversations and had noticed how Princess Catherine's face had gone pale when Louis described the lady's appearance in detail: golden hair, wearing a blue dress with pearls, and always carrying what looked like letters in her hand. The description had triggered something in Catherine's memory, something she clearly didn't want to pursue, but William's trained eye had caught the flash of recognition and fear that crossed her features. As the morning progressed, William found himself thinking about his own family. His daughter Sarah, now 25 and working as a teacher in London, had always been sensitive to atmospheres and emotions, much like Prince Louis. She often called him after difficult days at school, needing to talk through the emotional weight she absorbed from her troubled students. Perhaps that's why William felt such a strong protective instinct toward the young prince. He recognized the gift and the burden that came with being so attuned to others' feelings. The sound of small footsteps echoing down the corridor interrupted William's thoughts. Prince Louis appeared around the corner, moving with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. His usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by an expression of solemn determination that seemed far too mature for his 8 years. He nodded politely to William as he passed, but the guard noticed that the child's hands were trembling slightly, and his eyes held a distant quality that suggested his mind was processing something profound. "Good morning, Your Highness," William said formally, though his voice carried the warmth that had developed over years of watching Louis grow. "Good morning, Sergeant Hayes," Louis replied, but his voice lacked its usual spark. "Are my parents in their study?" "I believe so, sir. Shall I announce you?" Louis paused, considering the question with the gravity of someone weighing monumental decisions. "Not yet," he said finally. "I need to check something first. The sad lady, she showed me where to look." Before William could respond, the prince had continued down the hallway, his small figure disappearing around another corner with determined steps. The guard felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. In all his years of service, he had learned to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct was telling him that whatever Prince Louis was searching for would change everything they thought they knew about the palace and its secrets. The rest of the morning passed in an unusual quiet that seemed to settle over the entire wing of the palace. Even the normally bustling household staff moved through their duties with subdued efficiency, as if collectively sensing that something momentous was building just beneath the surface of their ordered routine. William remained at his post, but his attention was divided between his official duties and the nagging worry about what the perceptive young prince might discover in his determined search. As noon approached, the silence was broken by the sound of running footsteps. Prince Louis appeared again, but this time he was moving with urgent speed, his face flushed and his breathing rapid. In his small hands, he clutched what appeared to be an old, yellowed envelope, and his eyes held the wide, shocked expression of someone who had just uncovered a truth too large for his young mind to fully comprehend. Prince Louis burst through the doors of his parents' private study with the force of a small hurricane, his face flushed and his breath coming in short gasps. The yellowed envelope in his hands shook as violently as his entire body, and his eyes held the wild, frightened look of a child who had just witnessed something that would forever change his understanding of the world around him. Prince William looked up from his desk, where he had been reviewing official documents, immediately sensing the distress radiating from his youngest son. "Louis, what's wrong?" Catherine asked, rising from her chair near the window, where she had been reading correspondence for various charities. Her maternal instincts kicked in immediately, and she moved toward her son with practiced concern. But Louis stepped back, holding the envelope against his chest as if protecting it, or perhaps protecting himself from what it contained. "The sad lady," Louis whispered, his voice barely audible above the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. "She showed me where they kept her letters. She wants everyone to know the truth about what happened to her." His words tumbled out in a rush, each one carrying the weight of revelation and confusion that only a child forced to confront adult complexities could experience. William and Catherine exchanged a glance that spoke volumes about shared fears and unspoken knowledge. The description Louis had been giving of the mysterious woman had triggered memories they had hoped would remain buried forever. Catherine's hand moved instinctively to her throat, where she unconsciously touched the spot where pearls might rest, mirroring the gesture Louis had described seeing the sad lady make repeatedly. "What letters, sweetheart?" Prince William asked gently, though his voice carried an undertone of tension that his years of diplomatic training couldn't quite conceal. He stood up slowly, moving toward his son with the careful movements of someone approaching a frightened animal. "Where did you find that?" Louis looked between his parents with eyes that held far too much understanding for his 8 years. "Behind a panel in the blue drawing room. The one that's always cold, even when the heating is on." She stood there and pointed, and when I pushed where she showed me, it opened. He held out the envelope with trembling hands. "Her name is on it, Diana, and it's addressed to someone called James Hewitt." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine's face went completely white, and she gripped the back of the nearest chair so tightly her knuckles showed stark against her skin. Prince William's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly, a muscle twitching as he processed the implications of what his son had discovered. The name James Hewitt was one that had haunted the royal family for decades, a specter from the past that had been carefully managed and contained, but never fully resolved. "Louis," Prince William said carefully, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure, "I need you to give me that letter. Some things are too complicated for children to understand." But Louis shook his head with the stubborn determination that had characterized him since he could walk. "She said it was important. She said people needed to know the truth about Harry." His words hit the room like a physical blow, and Catherine actually staggered, reaching out to steady herself against the window frame. The mention of Prince Harry's name in connection with James Hewitt brought up one of the most painful and persistent rumors that had plagued the royal family. For years, tabloids and conspiracy theorists had suggested that Harry might not be Prince Charles's biological son, pointing to physical similarities between the young prince and Diana's former lover. The royal family had always dismissed these claims, but the whispers had never completely died away. "What exactly did she tell you?" Catherine managed to ask, though her voice was barely steady. She moved closer to Louis, kneeling down to his eye level despite the obvious distress the conversation was causing her. Her maternal instincts warred with her need to protect not just her son, but the entire family from potential scandal. Louis looked at his mother with eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding that should have been impossible at his age. "She was crying," he said simply. "She said she tried to tell the truth before she died, but nobody would listen. She said the letters prove that Harry is really Charles's son, not James's, but she was scared to show them because of what else they might reveal. Prince William sat down heavily in his chair, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that spoke to the enormous weight of what they were dealing with. The implications were staggering. If Diana had indeed left behind evidence that would definitively settle the paternity question, it would finally put to rest one of the most damaging rumors about the royal family. But what other secrets might those letters contain? What other revelations might emerge from correspondence between his mother and her former lover? She said there are more, Lewis continued, his child's honesty compelling him to share everything despite the obvious distress it was causing his parents, hidden in different places around the palace. She said she had to hide them because she was afraid of what would happen if the wrong people found them first. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. She said she knows someone tried to hurt her because of what she knew. Catherine's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. The suggestion that Diana's death might not have been the accident, it was ruled to be touched on conspiracy theories that had never been fully put to rest, despite official investigations and coroner's reports. The idea that Diana herself might be trying to communicate some hidden truth through her youngest grandson was both impossible to believe and impossible to dismiss. Lewis, Prince William said, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to contain, I need you to understand something very important. Some stories, some secrets, they can hurt people even when they're meant to help. Your grandmother, Princess Diana, she loved our family very much, but her life was very complicated. But she's not resting, Lewis insisted, his voice rising with the frustration of someone trying to communicate something vitally important to people who weren't understanding. She can't rest until the truth comes out. She said Uncle Harry needs to know that he really belongs, that the doubts have been hurting him his whole life. The mention of Harry's ongoing struggles with his place in the family hit particularly hard, given the very public rift that had developed in recent years. The young prince's decision to step back from royal duties, his move to America, and his increasingly bitter public statements about the institution had created wounds that were still raw and bleeding. The suggestion that some of his pain might stem from long-held doubts about his parentage added another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking situation. Catherine reached for her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she scrolled through her contacts. I think we need to call your father, she said to her husband. And perhaps we should contact Harry as well. The weight of that suggestion hung in the air like a physical presence. Prince Charles, now King Charles III, carried his own complex relationship with Diana's memory and the secrets of their troubled marriage. The idea of reopening those wounds, of potentially validating conspiracy theories that had dogged the family for decades, was not something that could be undertaken lightly. Lewis watched his parents with the keen perception that had always set him apart, reading their fear and confusion with the clarity that only children possess. Are you angry at me? He asked quietly, the confidence that had carried him through his revelation beginning to crack under the weight of his parents' obvious distress. Oh, sweetheart, no, Catherine said immediately, pulling him into her arms despite the letters still clutched in his small hands. We're not angry at you. You're very brave to tell us about this. It's very complicated, and we need to be very careful about what we do next. Prince William stood and began pacing the length of the study, his mind racing through the potential consequences of Lewis's discovery. The media attention alone would be devastating, regardless of what the letters actually contained. The royal family's carefully maintained public image, already strained by recent controversies, might not survive another major scandal. But could they really ignore what might be evidence that could heal old wounds and settle long-standing questions? She said something else. Lewis whispered against his mother's shoulder, his voice muffled but still clearly audible in the quiet room. She said to tell you that she forgives Papa Charles for everything, and that she wants him to forgive himself too. She said the guilt has been eating at him for too long. Both parents froze at these words, recognizing in them the kind of specific, intimate knowledge that only Diana would have possessed. The young prince's ability to channel such personal information was both miraculous and terrifying, suggesting that whatever was happening was far beyond normal explanation. As they held their son and contemplated the magnitude of what he had revealed, none of them noticed Sergeant William Hayes standing frozen outside the partially opened door, his face white with shock and his hands trembling as he processed every word he had just overheard. The loyal guard, who had dedicated his life to protecting the royal family's secrets, now found himself in possession of information that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Sergeant William Hayes stood frozen in the corridor, his body rigid with shock as the full implications of what he had just overheard crashed over him like a tidal wave. For 30 years, he had served the crown with unwavering loyalty, keeping secrets, protecting dignity, and maintaining the carefully constructed facade that allowed the monarchy to function. But nothing in his decades of service had prepared him for this moment, when the very foundations of everything he had dedicated his life to protecting seemed to be crumbling before his eyes. His hands shook uncontrollably as he stepped back from the door, his mind reeling with the weight of the revelations. The letter in Prince Louis's possession, the claims about Diana's spirit, the suggestions about Prince Harry's parentage, and, most devastating of all, the implication that there might have been something more sinister behind the Princess of Wales's death. It was too much for his orderly mind to process. The carefully compartmentalized world of royal protocol and proper procedures offered no guidance for dealing with supernatural communications from beyond the grave. William's legs suddenly felt weak, and he found himself reaching for the wall to steady himself. The corridor, which had been his domain for so many years, now felt foreign and threatening. Every shadow seemed to hide secrets. Every whisper of wind through the ancient windows carried the possibility of otherworldly voices. How could he continue to do his job, to protect this family, when the very nature of reality seemed to have shifted beneath his feet? The sound of footsteps approaching from the main staircase jolted him back to immediate awareness. Lady Susan Pemberton, the Queen's private secretary, was walking briskly toward the family's apartments, her arms full of official papers and her expression set in the focused determination of someone managing a particularly challenging day. William straightened his posture instinctively, his training taking over even as his mind continued to reel from what he had just learned. "Good afternoon, Sergeant Hayes," Lady Susan said as she approached, but her professional smile faltered when she saw the pallor of his face and the obvious distress in his eyes. "Are you quite well? You look rather pale." William opened his mouth to respond with the standard reassurance that everything was fine, but no words came out. How could he explain that he had just overheard something that might change everything they thought they knew about the royal family? How could he tell this woman, who had spent her career carefully managing public perception and media relations, that a dead princess might be communicating through an 8-year-old boy? I may need to speak with someone in authority," he managed to say, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears. "Something has come to my attention that requires immediate attention from the highest levels." Lady Susan's expression sharpened immediately. In her position, she was accustomed to dealing with potential crises, and she recognized the signs of someone grappling with information that could be explosive. "What kind of something, Sergeant? Can you be more specific?" Before William could answer, the door to the family's study opened, and Prince William emerged, his face grave and his movements heavy with the weight of difficult decisions. He stopped short when he saw the 2 palace staff members standing in the corridor, and William could see the internal debate playing out across the prince's features as he considered how much they might have overheard. "Your Royal Highness," Lady Susan began, but Prince William raised a hand to stop her. "Lady Susan, I'm afraid we may have a situation that requires your expertise," he said carefully, his diplomatic training evident in the way he chose his words. "And Sergeant Hayes," he paused, studying the guard's stricken expression, "I believe you may have heard more than you were supposed to." William nodded slowly, unable to trust his voice. The admission felt like a betrayal of everything he had been trained to do, to see nothing, hear nothing, and speak of nothing that might compromise the royal family. But the magnitude of what he had learned seemed to demand acknowledgement, even if he didn't fully understand what should be done with the knowledge. Prince William glanced back toward the study where Catherine and Louis remained, then made a decision that seemed to age him visibly. I think we need to convene an emergency meeting. Lady Susan, please contact my father immediately, and see if you can reach my brother as well. Tell them it's about Mother. The mention of Princess Diana caused Lady Susan's professional composure to slip slightly. Like everyone who worked closely with the royal family, she was aware of the sensitivities surrounding the late princess's memory and the various conspiracy theories that continue to circulate. The fact that Prince William was specifically invoking her name in the context of an emergency meeting suggested that something significant had occurred. "Sir, if I may," Lady Susan said carefully, "should I also alert the palace's security team? And perhaps our legal advisors?" Prince William considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "Not yet. Let's keep this contained to family for now." But he looked directly at William. "Sergeant Hayes, I'm going to have to ask for your absolute discretion in this matter. What you may have heard today could have far-reaching consequences, and I need to know that I can count on your loyalty." "Of course, Your Royal Highness," William replied, his voice finally finding some strength. "I've served this family for 30 years, and that won't change now. But, sir, if I may, what the young prince said about the princess, is it possible that—" "I don't know," Prince William interrupted, the honesty in his voice reflecting the confusion and uncertainty that he was clearly struggling with. "I honestly don't know what to make of any of this. But if there's even a possibility that Louis has found something that could affect our family's history, then we need to handle it properly." Inside the study, Catherine was holding Louis close, trying to process the enormity of what her son had revealed while simultaneously attempting to protect him from the potential consequences of his discovery. The young prince had fallen asleep in her arms, exhausted by the emotional weight of his supernatural encounter and the intense conversation with his parents. But even in sleep, his small hand remained clutched around the yellowed envelope, as if his subconscious was determined to protect the evidence he had uncovered. The letter itself lay unopened on Prince William's desk, seeming to pulse with potential energy despite being nothing more than aged paper and faded ink. Neither parent had been able to bring themselves to break the seal and read what Diana had written all those years ago. The fear of what they might discover warred with the need to know the truth, creating a paralysis that kept them frozen in indecision. Catherine looked up as her husband re-entered the room, followed by Lady Susan and Sergeant Hayes. The presence of additional people made the situation feel more real and more frightening, transforming what had been a private family crisis into something that would inevitably involve the machinery of palace protocol and damage control. "Any word from your father?" Catherine asked quietly, trying not to wake Louis. "Lady Susan is making the calls now," Prince William replied, taking his seat behind the desk, but avoiding looking at the letter that seemed to dominate the space. "I think we're going to need guidance on how to handle this." If word gets out, he didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood the potential for disaster that hung over them like a sword of Damocles. The media attention would be unprecedented, the public reaction unpredictable, and the damage to the monarchy's reputation could be irreparable. And yet, the possibility that the letters might contain information that could heal old wounds, particularly regarding Prince Harry's long-standing feelings of alienation from the family, made simply destroying them unthinkable. Lady Susan stepped forward, her phone in hand. "Your Royal Highness, I have His Majesty on the line. He's in Scotland, but he says he could be here within 3 hours. Should I also try to reach Prince Harry?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Harry's relationship with the family had become increasingly strained, and his public criticisms of the institution had created deep wounds that were still healing. The idea of contacting him about something involving their mother's memory was both necessary and potentially explosive. Prince William looked at his sleeping son, then at his wife, then at the letter that might hold the keys to resolving decades of pain and speculation. "Yes," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. "Contact Harry. If this is real, if there's any truth to what Lewis has discovered, then he has a right to know. Whatever our differences, he's still our family." As Lady Susan stepped into the corridor to make the difficult phone call, Sergeant William Hayes remained standing at attention, his mind struggling to reconcile his duty to protect the royal family with the supernatural elements of what he had witnessed. The rational part of his brain insisted that there had to be a logical explanation for everything. Perhaps Lewis had simply found old letters that had been misplaced. Perhaps his claims about seeing Diana were the product of an overactive imagination fueled by palace ghost stories. But another part of him, a deeper part that remembered his own grandmother's stories about spirits who couldn't rest until wrongs were righted, wondered if something far more profound was happening. Could it be that Princess Diana, in death, had found a way to finally tell the truth that she had been unable to share in life? And if so, what did that mean for all of them who had spent years protecting secrets that might never have needed protecting in the first place? The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the study, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and shift with otherworldly movement. As they waited for the rest of the family to arrive, each person in that room grappled with the possibility that everything they thought they knew about the past was about to be rewritten by the words of a dead princess, delivered through the innocent honesty of a child who saw things that others could not. The great hall of Kensington Palace had never felt more imposing than it did on that gray December afternoon when 3 generations of the royal family gathered to confront a truth that had been buried for over 2 decades. King Charles III arrived first, his face drawn with worry and exhaustion from the hurried flight from Scotland. Despite his 75 years, he moved with the purposeful stride of a man who had spent his entire life dealing with crises, though nothing quite like this had ever crossed his path. Prince Harry had flown in from California, his arrival creating a media frenzy that the palace staff had worked frantically to contain. The sight of him walking through the same corridors he had once called home brought a mixture of emotions to everyone present. Hope for reconciliation, fear of renewed conflict, and uncertainty about how he would react to what his nephew had discovered. The years of distance and bitter public statements had created walls that seemed almost insurmountable, but the mention of his mother's name had been enough to bring him across an ocean. Sergeant William Hayes stood at his post outside the family meeting room, his uniform perfectly pressed and his posture impeccable, but inside he felt as though his entire world had been turned upside down. The last few hours had been a blur of frantic activity as the palace had prepared for this unprecedented gathering. He had watched as security protocols were heightened, as staff members whispered in concerned huddles, and as the weight of secrecy settled over the entire residence like a heavy blanket. The meeting had been going on for over an hour, and William could hear the occasional raised voice filtering through the heavy oak doors. King Charles's measured tones mixed with Prince William's earnest explanations, while Prince Harry's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who had spent years feeling excluded from family decisions. Most heartbreaking of all were the moments when Prince Louis's young voice could be heard, trying to explain encounters and experiences that defied rational explanation. Lady Susan Pemberton moved through the corridors like a woman possessed, coordinating damage control efforts while simultaneously trying to manage a situation that had no precedent in all her years of palace protocol. She had already fielded 17 calls from various media outlets who had somehow gotten wind that something unusual was happening, and her carefully crafted responses of no comment were beginning to wear thin. "Any word from inside?" she asked William as she paused near his position, her usual composed demeanor showing cracks of stress and exhaustion. "Nothing definitive, ma'am," William replied, though his trained ear had picked up enough fragments of conversation to know that the family was grappling with revelations that went far beyond what any of them had expected. The letter that Prince Louis had found was apparently just the beginning. There were references to additional documents, to hidden compartments throughout the palace, and to secrets that stretched back to the very foundations of Diana's relationship with the royal family. Inside the meeting room, the atmosphere was thick with tension and barely contained emotion. The yellowed envelope lay open on the polished mahogany table, its contents spread out like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that was only beginning to take shape. Diana's handwriting, still elegant despite the obvious emotional state in which the letter had been written, covered several pages of personal stationery. The words revealed not just the truth about Prince Harry's parentage, but also Diana's desperate attempts to protect information that she believed could destabilize the monarchy. King Charles sat with his head in his hands, aged by the weight of reading his deceased wife's final thoughts about their marriage and her fears for their children's future. The letter confirmed what DNA tests had quietly established years earlier, that Harry was indeed his biological son, but it also revealed Diana's growing paranoia about forces within the establishment who she believed were working against her. Her descriptions of feeling watched, of having her phones monitored, and of receiving subtle threats painted a picture of a woman who had been living in fear during her final months. "She was trying to protect all of us," Prince William said quietly, his voice thick with emotion as he read through his mother's words again. "She hid these letters because she was afraid that if the truth came out about the surveillance, about how closely they were watching her, it would damage the institution beyond repair." Prince Harry, who had been silent for most of the meeting, finally looked up from the documents. His eyes were red with unshed tears, and his voice was barely steady when he spoke. "So she chose to let the world think I might not be legitimate rather than expose how she was being treated? She protected the family that was destroying her." The question hung in the air like an accusation, and King Charles finally lifted his head to meet his younger son's gaze. "Your mother loved the monarchy, Harry. Despite everything that happened between us, despite all the pain, she believed in the institution and what it could represent. These letters, they show that she was willing to sacrifice her own reputation to preserve something she saw as bigger than herself." Prince Louis, who had been sitting quietly between his parents throughout the meeting, suddenly stirred. His young eyes had the distant quality that had become familiar to his family, and when he spoke, it was with the gravity of someone much older than his 8 years. "She's here," he said simply. "She wants Uncle Harry to know that she's proud of the man he's become, even though she's sad about how much pain he's carried." The silence that followed was profound. Even those who had been skeptical about Louis's claims found themselves unable to dismiss the specific, intimate nature of what he was sharing. The young prince continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was conveying. "She says the guilt has to stop now. Grandpa Charles, she forgives you for everything, and she wants you to forgive yourself. Uncle Harry, she says your pain is real and valid, but you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Prince Harry broke down completely then, years of resentment and hurt pouring out in wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. King Charles, moving with surprising speed for his age, crossed the room to embrace his son for the first time in years. The sight of the two men holding each other, finally beginning to bridge the chasm that had opened between them, brought tears to every eye in the room. Outside in the corridor, Sergeant William Hayes felt his knees buckle as the emotional weight of what he was witnessing finally overwhelmed his carefully maintained composure. The loyal guard, who had dedicated his life to serving the crown with dignity and discretion, found himself sliding down the wall to sit on the floor, his body shaking with shock and exhaustion. The revelations of the day had shattered not just his understanding of the royal family's history, but his faith in the very nature of reality itself. Lady Susan found him there 20 minutes later, sitting with his head in his hands and his shoulders shaking with silent tears. Without hesitation, she sat down beside him on the floor, her own professional facade finally cracking under the strain of the day's events. 30 years, William whispered, his voice broken with emotion. 30 years I've been protecting secrets that maybe didn't need protecting. all the whispers about Prince Harry, all the pain that family has endured, and it could have been prevented if we had just trusted in the truth. How could any of us have known? Lady Susan replied gently, her own voice reflecting the exhaustion they all felt. None of us could have predicted that a child would, that Princess Diana would find a way to. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't quite bring herself to voice the supernatural explanation that seemed to be the only way to make sense of everything that had happened. But as they sat together in that ancient corridor, surrounded by centuries of royal history and tradition, both of them found themselves accepting that some things transcended the rational world they had always relied upon. When the meeting finally ended, nearly 3 hours after it had begun, the royal family emerged transformed. The letters Diana had hidden contained more than just clarification about Harry's parentage. They revealed a woman who had been desperately trying to protect her sons while navigating a system that she felt was closing in around her. The discovery had not only vindicated Prince Harry, but had also opened a path toward healing that none of them had thought possible. As the family members said their goodbyes, making plans for follow-up conversations, and official statements that would need to be carefully crafted, Prince Louis approached Sergeant Hayes with the serious expression that had become so familiar over the past few hours. "She wanted me to thank you," the young prince said quietly, "for always keeping the family safe, even when it was hard. She says your loyalty has been a comfort to all of them, and that you don't need to carry any guilt about the secrets anymore." William looked down at this extraordinary child who had somehow become a conduit for healing decades-old wounds, and for the first time in hours, he felt his heart begin to lighten. Perhaps some secrets were meant to be kept, and others were meant to be revealed. Perhaps his years of faithful service had been leading to this moment, when he could be present to witness not the destruction of the institution he had served, but its redemption through truth and forgiveness. As the December sun set over Kensington Palace that evening, painting the ancient walls in shades of gold and amber, there was a sense of peace that had been absent for far too long. The truth had finally emerged from its hiding place, carried by the innocent honesty of a child who saw beyond the veils that separated the living from the dead. And in that revelation, a family had begun to heal, secrets had lost their power to wound, and the memory of Princess Diana had finally found the rest that had eluded her for over 20 years. The sad lady who had wandered the corridors was sad no more, and her youngest grandson slept peacefully that night, knowing that he had fulfilled a mission greater than anything his 8 years should have prepared him for. The palace itself seemed to breathe easier, as if decades of held breath had finally been released, allowing new air to fill spaces that had been suffocating under the weight of buried truth.